So if everyone can start coming in and taking seats, we will get the program launched. I'll wait about 30 more seconds, and then for the sake of keeping consistent with what's going to be a full day program, we'll just go ahead and move into the morning announcements. Good morning. Morning. Okay, well, we know that there's going to be a lot of people still trying to make their way through registration. Again, for the sake of keeping on schedule, we'll go ahead and get started and revisit the details along the way as we need to. But good morning and welcome. I'm Dr. Jennifer Jurado, Broward County's Chief Resilience Officer and Director of Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division. It's my pleasure to serve as MC for today's summit. And before we get started, I wanted to take a few minutes to introduce some basic information to you. Our space logistics, as I think you'll see, are pretty simple. All summit sessions will be held here in this room. Lunches will be served next door in the other half of the ballroom. And tonight's reception will be held in the lobby from 5 to 6:30 p.m. The press room will host this afternoon's press event and is open to the press throughout the day. It's located in room 301, back here to the left. Should you require any assistance over the course of the day, please look for a Broward County staff member who can be identified with a blue name tag or green polo shirts, or you can visit our staff at the registration table. Please do, at this time, place your cell phones on vibrate or silent and keep them there, please, throughout the summit. If you need to make a call or need to take a conversation, we kindly ask that you step outside. The summit is being recorded and should be available next week for access on the Compact website. In addition, several of the panels throughout the day will be live broadcast, and they'll be presented tomorrow via Facebook at the Climate Leadership at Climate Leadership Summit, all one word. We encourage you to use the hashtag Summit 2017 in social media and tag at SEFL_compact. The Wi-Fi network password is Climate17, as noted on your table cards. Speakers, we do have the first row reserved for you. Please come up here and sit if you're on the next panel. We have designed the program to be interactive and encourage participation throughout the summit. We do expect time for questions at the end of most panels, and so when the time comes, please line up in these central aisles, and our staff will have microphones for being able to relay your questions. Having addressed all of these pre-event details, it is now my pleasure to introduce a recognized environmental leader here in Broward County and regionally, a climate champion truly, and that is Broward County Mayor Beamfer. Please join me in welcoming him.
This looks like when I used to teach school and everybody would sit in the back. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. It is my great honor to formally open the 9th Annual Southeast Florida Regional Climate Leadership Summit on behalf of the Broward County Board of County Commissioners and our partners in the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. And thank you all for being here today. And before I go any further, I want to recognize the hard work of the many Broward County staff members, and I know, Jennifer, you've been working unbelievably hard on this for a long time, as well as your entire staff. And their colleagues from our compact partners who made this event possible. So thank you all for all the work to make this happen. This is the third time that Broward County has hosted the summit, and it's always a privilege for us, especially since it allows us to remember the history that was made here in this convention center at the first summit back in 2009, when Broward, Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Monroe counties signed the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact and embarked on a regional collaboration that has exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. In 9 short years, the compact has become nationally and internationally known and admired for its extremely effective model of regional cooperation and advancement. And among our many accomplishments are a unified sea level rise projection for Southeast Florida, important regional vulnerability analysis and greenhouse gas inventories, the first regional climate action plan revised in 2012 with over 100 recommendations for aligning our region around a common voluntary agenda of climate adaptation and emissions reduction actions, a series of workshops and guidance documents to help implement many of those plan recommendations and many other cooperative programs and endeavors. And as you'll hear later this morning, and again this afternoon, a second regional climate action plan that builds on the first plan and includes new areas of emphasis, including public health, social equity, and economic resilience. Economic resilience, as you can probably tell by the tagline of this year's summit, the business of resilience, will be the focus of the next 2 days. The summit is intended to capitalize on the rapid evolution of awareness and interest in action in our business community over the last 2 years, and to help unite us all around a regional agenda for investment and positive change in the coming years. Our emphasis on economic resilience does not mean we wish to downplay any of the vital areas connected to climate change. Of course, but a strong economy and successful businesses are key to ensuring that we have the resources to tackle the challenges before us. In concert with our business community and many other stakeholders, we intend to make Southeast Florida a world leader in resilience and to transform our energy, transportation, and built environment systems accordingly, thereby securing our region's future for decades to come. We have a very full, rich agenda of speakers and panels to lay out the challenges and opportunities, and I know you're going to learn a lot over the next couple days. I'm proud to announce that this is the largest summit in compact history with over 650 attendees, and we hope you have an opportunity to connect with colleagues and network with new people while you're here with us over the next couple of days. And at this point, what I'd like is all the elected officials in the room to stand up and be recognized. You all could stand up, everybody, all the elected officials. Thank you. Holding elected office is a privilege, and it requires a lot of time and an effort to do it well. I want to thank all of those elected officials who just stood and those who will be joining us later for demonstrating their commitment to serving their constituents by attending this summit. We also have received a record-setting amount of support from our sponsors, as you can tell by all the tables out there. I would be here all morning if I read the names of all the sponsors, so instead I want to encourage you to turn to the inside back cover of your program and make note of all the generous contributions from all of our sponsors. If you get a chance, please thank them personally when you go around to the tables. I want to recognize the key partners who participate in the day-to-day work of this summit through representation on the Compact Staff Steering Committee. Monroe, Miami-Dade, and Palm Beach counties, the cities of West Palm Beach, Hollywood, Miami Beach, and Key West, the Nature Conservancy, the South Florida Regional Planning Council, the South Florida Water Management District, and the Institute for Sustainable Communities. They have all taken a big part in this. In particular, I want to acknowledge the intensive efforts of Palm Beach County in preparing for the 8th summit of October of last year, for those who remember, which was unfortunately canceled at the very last minute due to Hurricane Matthew. Organizing a summit requires a lot of time and energy, and we did not want the hard work of our friends in Palm Beach County to go unnoticed, and note to ourselves, no more summits during the hurricane season, okay? But thank you for Palm Beach County for last year. After the cancellation of last year's summit, we in Broward County certainly acknowledge our good fortune in hosting our event this year after hurricane season, but 2017 was no picnic. As we all know, Florida sustained severe damages to life and property from Hurricane Irma, and we also witnessed the destruction wrought by Hurricanes Harvey and Maria. This year was a stark example of the threat that extreme storms pose to our region, especially now that climate change is likely making those storms a little bit more intense. As you know, climate change is perhaps the defining issue of the 21st century and for the centuries to come. Changes to the physical conditions of the Earth and our atmosphere are already affecting our planet's environment, the plants and animals, societies, and economies in dramatic ways. Hurricane intensification is just one of the many impacts we are witnessing in Southeast Florida. Along with sea level rise, nuisance flooding, saltwater contamination of our drinking waters, aquifers, the spread of vector-borne illnesses, and extreme heat and precipitation. Florida's susceptibility to extreme weather is not a new phenomenon, of course, but it is increasingly serious due to the intensification of tropical weather systems caused by climate changes and by population growth and increased economic development along our coastlines. And so it is with this heightened awareness of our vulnerability to extreme storms in mind that I am extremely pleased to introduce the summit's first keynote speaker, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, a world-renowned atmospheric scientist and climate change communicator. Dr. Hayhoe is professor of political science and director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. Her research focuses on developing and applying high-resolution climate projections to understand what climate change means for people and the natural environment. She has a bachelor's degree in physics from the University of Toronto and a master's and doctoral degrees in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. Dr. Hayhoe has served as lead author for the second and third U.S. National Climate Assessments and has conducted climate impact assessments for a broad cross-section of organizations, cities, and regions, from Boston Logan Airport to the state of California. Her work has appeared in over 120 peer-reviewed publications. In addition, as a world-class climate scientist and a Christian, Dr. Hayhoe may defy stereotypes about the politics of religion and science, but defying stereotypes invites inquiry, which can lead to communication and even to learning. And it creates opportunity for thinking deeply about and aligning values and action. She has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people and one of Foreign Policy's 100 leading global thinkers, as one of Politico's 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics, and one of Fortune's 50 world's greatest leaders. She has also received the National Center for Science Education's Friend of the Planet Award, the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize, and the Sierra Club's Distinguished Service Award. Dr. Hayhoe is currently serving as lead author for the upcoming 4th National Climate Assessment and producing the 2nd season of her PBS Digital Studios short series, Global Weirding, Climate, Politics, and Religion. Dr. Hayhoe was kind enough to interrupt a family vacation, I believe, to address us by video this morning, and we are extremely honored to have her as our first keynote speaker. Please help me thank and welcome her with a very warm round of applause.
So much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you virtually. And I want to offer a big thanks to Jennifer and all of the other on the organizing committee to be willing to have this zero carbon talk, which is fantastic. There's always an irony, you know, to going around talking about climate change when you're flying around the country. And so I absolutely love the opportunity to be able to talk to you. And hopefully everybody can see me and hear me almost as if I were in the same room. Is everything looking good? All right, thank you. Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen with you here. How do we build resilience to a changing climate? We know what resilience looks like because Florida is already one of the leading states in this area. We know what the risks we face are. We know how they are increasing in many cases. And we know how we can build, or at least start to build, resilience to some of these risks. But let's start at the very beginning. Why do we even care about this issue? Because we know that in the normal way of things, normal climate, it goes up and down from day to day and even from year to year. We have wet years and dry years. We have hot days and cold days. If you just take a look at headlines across Florida for the last 6 months or so, back in May, the headline was, "Move over, California. Florida has the USA's worst drought." And at that time, there were headlines talking about the wildfires that were burning throughout the state. Then in June, the headline was, "June's heavy rains wash away Florida's severe drought." And of course, we know towards the end of the summer and the beginning of the fall, we had that incredible string of hurricanes. Everything is underwater. I mean, everything. And then after Irma, there was a headline saying ferocious fires like California's are possible in Florida. So we know that we already deal with crazy weather extremes in Florida. And if that's the case, why does climate change matter? Now, just a brief definition. Climate change matters because even though we go up and down, hot, cold, wet, dry, our civilization, our society, our infrastructure is built on an assumption that we don't often take out and look at very much. That is the assumption that over climate timescales, which is at least 20 to 30 years, it all averages out. That is the assumption that our society is built on. Not only that, but we also assume that the range of variability we've seen in the past is a perfect predictor of what we can expect in the future. The drought of record, the 100-year flood, we assume that these are predictors of the risk that we face in the future. And we plant our crops, we build our buildings, we draw our flood zones, and we even design our water plans based on this assumption of stationarity. In other words, that even though we have ups and downs, as we always normally do, it's all going to average out in the end. What happens if it doesn't? What happens if that baseline is changing? And even worse, what happens if the variability is changing? That's why we care about a changing climate, not because Florida isn't already naturally exposed to heat and drought and flood and hurricane. Of course it is. But when we see risks changing, that puts our infrastructure at risk, that puts our homes at risk, puts our economy at risk. It puts the places where we live and the ways that we live at risk. The best analogy that I have found to the problem that we are facing comes from my part of the world. So just like much of Florida, West Texas is very flat. In fact, you could drive a long ways north of Lubbock on I-27, just driving along, staying not just on the road, but even in your own lane, if you were looking in the rearview mirror. Now, I don't recommend it, but it would work. Why? Because the road is so straight. So where you were 1 minute, 5 minutes, even 10 minutes ago, where you were is a perfect predictor of where you're going to be in the future because the road is straight. But just before you get to the next town off the top of this map, Plainview, Texas, just before you get there, there is a giant curve in the road. Not only is there a giant curve, but there's a row of concrete silos on the curve. So what happens if you are driving up that road looking in your rearview mirror? I hope everybody knows the answer to that. You're going to end up in a different place than where you plan to be. Why? Because the past was no longer a perfect predictor for the future. And so in the same way, planning for the future based on the past is like driving down the road looking in a rearview mirror. It works great when climate is not changing, when it is relatively stable as it has been over much of the course of human civilization on this planet. But when climate is changing, when we are already on the curve, when our wheels are already on the rumble strip as they are today, we need to look to the future to plan as well. We cannot assume that our risks will be identical to those that we faced in the past. So, question number 2 is climate changing then? Well, we know that we're not talking about the weather from day to day. Weather is what happens in a certain place at a certain time. You know, weather can be record hot, record cold. Weather can be an individual storm event. we're talking about climate, which is the accumulated statistics of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. So weather is like a tree and climate is like a forest. We know at the global scale that temperature is going up. We know that right here in Florida, annual temperatures are increasing. They've been increasing by about 0.1 degrees over the last 120 years, 0.4 degrees over the last 55 years. We know that sea levels rising and oceans are warming. And, of course, the big one, we know that hurricanes are also being affected by a changing climate. How are they being affected? Well, first of all, as sea level rises, storm surges become more powerful. So a given storm surge is stronger with higher sea level than it would have been otherwise. We also know that hurricanes get their energy from warm ocean water. And over 90% of the extra heat that is being trapped inside the climate system by the heat trapping gases that we produce, over 90% of that heat is going into the ocean where it feeds hurricanes. Hurricanes on average today are intensifying about 9 hours sooner and faster than they did about 25 years ago. But, and this is brand new research that was just released yesterday because we have the big American Geophysical Union meeting going on with all the earth scientists in North and South America. This is where all the results get released. And so just yesterday, 2 brand new studies were announced. They looked specifically at Hurricane Harvey. And what we found is what we expect. As the world warms, water evaporates faster. And so there's more water vapor sitting up there in the atmosphere for a storm, even a normal storm, let alone a giant storm like Harvey, to sweep up and dump on us. So studies looking at the rainfall associated with Hurricane Harvey that were just published yesterday, what did these studies find? They found that Hurricane Harvey's 7-day rainfall total increased by at least 19% compared to a similar storm that would have occurred, back in the 1950s. So think about that, 30 to 50 inches. At least about 20% of that was higher than it would have been back in the 1950s. And a different paper found that the record 3-day rainfall was 3 times more likely than it would have been in the early 1900s. So we are seeing increased rainfall associated with these storms as well. Heat waves are getting stronger and more frequent. This is a picture of a heat wave in recent years. And we're also seeing increases in heavy precipitation. Why? For the same reason as we are seeing more intense precipitation with hurricanes. As the world warms, water vapor levels in the atmosphere increase. And so when a storm comes along, there's all this water vapor sitting up there for the storm to sweep up and dump on us. That's why our heavy precipitation is going up as well. And of course, we're also vulnerable to sea level rise. Sea level rise has risen about 8 inches in the last 100 years, but it appears to be accelerating. Future projections all show increases that are likely at a rate greater than we've seen over the last century. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Florida is already at risk from devastating climate and weather events. This is a map from NOAA showing how many weather and climate events that have caused at least $1 billion worth of damage have occurred since 1980. And yes, this map does include Irma. You can see that although Texas is actually the worst, I don't know if you knew that, that's because Texas gets every single type of natural climate and weather event you can imagine. Although Texas is the worst, Florida is up there. The Southeast is uniquely vulnerable to drought, to heat, to severe tornadoes and thunderstorms, and of course to hurricanes as well. So we are already naturally at risk. And why do we care about a changing climate? We care about a changing climate because it takes the natural risks we already face today and it exacerbates them. That is why we care. So, how do we prepare for an uncertain future? Because even though we know we're on that curve in the road, the curve is foggy. We don't have 20/20 vision. We can see the rough outlines of the road, but we're not quite sure if it's this wide, or if it curves like this, or if it curves a bit more steeply like that. And in a sense, how steeply the road curves actually depends on the choices that we make that drive a changing climate. So it's a little bit like Schrodinger's cat. By the act of looking to the future, we actually have the ability to change how steep that curve is that we're going to negotiate. Isn't that an interesting thought? How do we do this? Well, the first thing we do, it's not so hard. We say, what type of events already affect us in the places where we live? Are we at risk from wildfires? Are we at risk from flooding from rapid snowmelt? No, not so much in Florida. Are we at risk from tropical storms? Absolutely. What about heat waves? We identify the events that already affect us. For certain type of events, we can simply build resilience to the risks that already exist. For certain types of extreme weather and climate events like supercell thunderstorms, derecho winds, tornadoes, the jury is still out. We have some indications that we're starting to see changes in trends in the geographic distribution, in the clustering potential of these events, but it's too early to say. On the other hand, we know they're not going away, right? So it just makes sense to build resilience to the risks that already exist. What type of risks already exist? Just look at the map of this year. The red shaded map I just showed you, this is the map only for this year, and it's showing you the specific types of events. We know what events we are already at risk for. We know they're not going away. It just makes sense to build resilience to those risks, right? For other purposes, we can use the direction of the trend. In other words, is a certain risk getting more frequent? Is it getting more intense? Or is it getting less frequent and less intense? Then we know enough about the vulnerability of our system and the direction of future change to build even more resilience, or less if the risk is going down, into our future planning. Let's take sea level rise. These are figures from the brand new Climate Science Special Report that just came out a few weeks ago. You can find it at science2017.globalchange.gov. This is from chapter 12, which is the sea level rise chapter. And as you can see from the broad range of sea level rise projections on the top figure, there is significant uncertainty regarding whether we're looking at, a 1 foot increase by 2100 or over an 8-foot increase by 2100 globally. This chapter concludes that relative to 2000, global mean sea level, that's GMSL, global mean sea level is very likely to rise by an additional 0.3 to 0.6 feet by 2030, a half a foot to 1.2 feet by 2050, and 1 to 4 feet by 2100. But we added a caveat, and the caveat is that for higher scenarios, we cannot rule out a rise exceeding 8 feet by 2100. That is a huge range. And if you just take the intermediate scenario, a middle scenario, and you actually look at the relative changes around the world, that's the bottom map, you can see that relative changes along the Gulf of Mexico and along Florida are relatively high. So this is a case where we know the direction of the trend, there's significant uncertainty in it, but we at least know that things are moving in a certain direction and we have a range that we can work with. For other impacts, we need more information. The future is uncertain, but we do know that if we use the past as a guide, we're going to get the wrong answer. What type of information do we want more granular, more quantitative information on? Well, to get these site-specific projections, this is a lot of what I do and many others do too, we start with our future scenarios. We put them into these big global climate models, and then the information from the climate models is downscaled to individual cities and locations and counties and regions to generate the information we need to answer questions like, what size storm sewer pipes do we need? This is a study we did for the state of Delaware, and we found that heavy rainfall was increasing faster upstate than it was increasing downstate. So if we want to know, do we need medium-sized pipes, small-sized pipes, giant? Now, these giant pipes aren't anything they would actually use in Delaware. This is from Colorado. But the point is that there's a real cost associated with the size of the pipes that you put in. And so if you can have some indication of the numbers on what type of heavy precipitation we expect in runoff, that helps guide the size of the pipes. Other analysis we've done for airports looks at how often temperature will exceed a threshold that's associated with, the runway material starting to get sticky. Maybe they need to use a different type of asphalt to cover the surface. When it gets really hot already in some places like Phoenix, airplanes can't even take off. How often do we expect that to happen in the future? We can look at extremes like this, and these are some of the indicators that the National Climate Assessment, in this case I'm showing you figures from the third National Climate Assessment, these are some of the information that they looked at too. How do we expect the number of days over 95 degrees or below freezing to change in the future? I'm going to close with a little case study that we did for Chicago. Chicago is the very first city that I ever worked with. And it's fascinating because over the last 10 years, I've been able to observe the full arc of how they were using the information that we provided to make decisions. So if you're a city, if you're a county, if you're a region, what's the first step? The first step, again, is to identify the risks that you naturally face already. And one of the big risks that Chicago faced was flooding. Another one was heat waves, believe it or not. Then you plan for the impacts. I still remember that day when I went up to the city of Chicago. They called in every single city department. They put us in a room with no windows and sack lunches. And they basically said, don't come out until you figured out what to do. I could tell by the look in everybody's eyes that they're wondering why they were there. And at that point, I was kind of wondering why I was there too. But we started to talk and we started to kind of go through, well, we could look at days per year over 90 degrees. And the Chicago Transit Authority said, well, could you look at days per year over 92 degrees? And we said, well, yes, we could. We can't tell you, 1 year versus the next, the exact number, but decade by decade, we can tell you how much they'll be increasing. Why? Well, because our Metra rail lines, and that's a picture of a Metra train right there, our rapid transit commuter line rails, they warp over 92 degrees. And so we have to shut down the metro. We have to bus people. It's very expensive. If we knew that we were going to get a certain amount of days on average over that threshold every year, we would proactively replace our rails in the problem areas. And then the emergency response people said, well, okay, can you tell us, days per year over 95 degrees? And we said, yes, we can do that. And they said, well, we staff by the thermometer in the south side of Chicago. When it gets hot, there's fires, there's illness, there's a lot of ambulance calls. We even get irritable in extreme heat. There's more fights, there's more violence when it's hot out. And then the people who run the roads in Chicago, they said, well, what about variability? What about how many times we cross the freeze-thaw barrier? Because elections in Chicago are won or lost sometimes on potholes. We said, yeah, we could look at that too. So we looked at how often heat waves would occur, like the 1995 and 99 heat waves that killed hundreds of people within the city limits. We looked at how frequently extreme heat might overload the electricity system, causing brownouts and even blackouts. We looked at how often their storm sewers might flood, how many days per year they might have over 2.4 inches in 24 hours, which is associated with combined sewer overflow. And on the left-hand side, you can see that this has already happened. This is a risk that they are already coping with today. So we generated, all told, over 150, I think, indicators for the public school district to look at their energy use, for Chicago parks to figure out what type of trees to plant in the future. If one tree dies, you don't replace it with the same tree. You replace it with a tree that's native to about 200 miles further south, so that when it reaches maturity, it will be at just the right climate zone for that tree. We did these projections for 14 out of 18 city departments. And then after that, they said, thank you very much. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder what they're going to do with this information. So over the next few years, I followed what was happening in Chicago. And one of the things that happened just a couple of years after our study was quite shocking. They got sued by farmers insurance. I don't know if you heard about this. They got sued for the fact that the insurance companies felt that they were bearing the brunt of the flooding damages, and they said that the city hadn't adequately prepared for the damages that climate change was causing to increase their flood risk. That was a little ironic because they couldn't say they hadn't heard about it because we had told them. But then, a year later, I found these headlines. New sewers quickly dispatch heavy rains and massive new reservoir to help alleviate Chicago area flooding. So, what can we do to prepare for an uncertain future? We can acknowledge that many of the risks that we already face today are changing, whether it's remapping flood zones or recognizing that wildfire risk is changing. We can recognize that our disaster is a function of our weather and climate events and our exposure. As our population grows, as our infrastructure grows, our exposure is going up. For many weather and climate events, the intensity or the frequency is also going up. That's why it makes it even more important as exposure goes up, as the risk from weather and climate goes up, to decrease our vulnerability, because that we are able to do at the local scale. So what can we do to prepare for the risks? Well, one thing that Chicago decided to do was a green roof initiative. They are actually lowering the temperature of their city by, hopefully, the amount that climate change is pushing it up. How amazing is that? Over in the Netherlands, where of course a large part of their country is already below sea level, they're building floating villages. So as sea level goes up 3-4 feet, you get another 3 or 4 feet of anchor chain, right? There's many more examples of adaptation at the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, and I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this resource, and if you're not, you absolutely should check it out. I'm sure that many of the projects represented by people in the room are actually on this site. But here's the bottom line. We are on a curve. Does that mean we should slam on the brakes? No. If you're driving down a road and you're on a curve, you don't slam on the brakes even if there's some fog ahead. You slow down, but you proceed cautiously into the future. How do we do that? By, number one, building our resilience to the risks that we already know exist. Number two, increasing our resilience to the risks that we know are getting stronger or more frequent. And number three, incorporating quantitative information into our planning for the risks that we know are intensifying under greater change. In that way, rather than slamming on our brakes and coming to a halt, we can keep on moving into the future. We can negotiate that curve, making sure that we're all staying on the road. And I think that's the goal of what we're all doing. Thank you.
Dr. Hayhoe is kind enough to spend a few more minutes with us this morning, and so for those who may have questions for her, we do have staff that are available with microphones and would encourage that you would come up and take advantage of the opportunity to speak directly with Dr. Hayhoe before she departs this morning. Do you have any questions? All right, well, we have a reluctant audience. Let's see. We have a question here in the back. Thank you. And I'd like to remind the panelists who will be coming up in the subsequent sessions that they'll need to come up to the front of the room and get a lavalier mic. So in advance of your sessions, please come up to your right-hand side for that. Yes, question,
Hi.
please.
Nancy Gassman, City, Fort Lauderdale. Of the things that Chicago did in response to the data you provided, what to you were some of the more surprising things?
I was surprised. It was my very first project 10 years ago, so I was surprised by many of the things that they did. And since then, I've worked with Washington, D.C., Austin, San Antonio, many other cities as well. But in Chicago, I was surprised by the innovative approach that they took. I mean, everything from looking at planting different types of trees in their parks that were more suited to a southern climate, to their concerns, actually probably this was the most surprising thing, their concerns about the Chicago River. Because it turns out the Chicago River is engineered to flow backwards into the Midwestern River system rather than forwards into Lake Michigan. Why? It's because it's actually quite polluted. If you get combined sewer overflow, a lot of it goes into the river. And if it goes into Lake Michigan, it would violate the International Joint Commission regulations on the water quality in the Great Lakes. So they were very concerned about the extent to which higher evaporation rates and changing rainfall, seasonal rainfall, would affect the Great Lake levels, because if they went down too far, They were afraid that the Chicago River would start flowing back into Lake Michigan, and then they would be hauled into international court for polluting the Great Lakes. So that was absolutely fascinating. It turned out that that wasn't such a concern as they thought. But I love their innovative solutions like green roofs, even looking at greening areas of the city where the urban heat island effect is particularly intense, and especially where a lot of people live who can't afford to run their air conditioning, who are scared to open their windows at night because of safety concerns. They really took these issues seriously, and I loved seeing the combination of the social justice concerns with the concerns about a changing climate, because the one thing we know wherever we are, Florida, Texas, Chicago, Southeast Asia, wherever we are in the world, we know that the poorest and most vulnerable, the sick and the weak, the people who don't have the resources, they are the ones who will be disproportionately affected by a changing climate.
Thank you. Another question.
Hello, I'm Alex from Broward County. With all the organizations and governments that you've worked with, what sort of pushback have you had to face, and what did you do to overcome it?
Thank you. So a lot of the pushback I get is more when I'm just speaking to people about how climate change is real and humans are responsible. When I go in to work with a city or a state or a province, I'm usually going in because they have already become convinced from looking at their own information that they are on a curve and they want some help negotiating that curve. That said, though, we recently had a NOAA grant to work with some small towns in Texas and Oklahoma. So that was a very interesting experience because we actually had to go out and find some small towns and convince them that this really was a problem that they wanted us to look at. Even if we were doing it for free, essentially, to them, it was still, is this something that we should be spending our time on because we don't even think it's a real problem? So the way that we began that is really the way we begin almost any project, but we were much more focused on getting people together, physically together in a room and saying, okay, tell me your stories. Tell me what's happened to you. What did the drought of 2011 look like here in your town? What about crazy storms? Do you get those? How about winter weather conditions? What about heat? Get them talking about the types of extremes they had already seen in the past, and then go away and look at the historic data. So don't go to future projections yet. Go to historic data and say, okay, you really got hit hard by X. Does it look like X is changing at all? In some cases, the answer might be no, or we don't know. But in some cases, the answer was, yeah, did you know that your extreme heat days are twice as frequent now as they used to be 50 years ago? And then people will be like, oh, well, that's what the data is actually saying. Well, maybe we should keep on looking at this. And so often ground truthing what we're seeing to real places, real stories, real impacts, and real data helps people to understand why this is important, even though they might not be on board at the beginning.
Another question.
One of the biggest challenges in this is how are we going to pay for the fixes that need to be changed? Once awareness is raised and we need new sewer pipes or the things that you're talking about, how do you pay for it? How did Chicago pay for this? How did Delaware pay for the new pipes that they said? And how do you see moving forward, what's the best way to get the big dollars that we need to make the fixes that need to happen?
That is a tough question. So I don't know, just to be clear, I don't know if Delaware has done anything with their storm sewers yet. I always kind of follow the news after my projects end. But with Chicago, it took almost, not quite, but almost 10 years and a lawsuit from Farmers Insurance before they were actually starting to put in the new sewer system. It is not easy because we are dealing with a situation where all the big infrastructure projects, the really, really big ones, they were built decades, even over a century ago in some places. Why was Houston such a disaster? It wasn't only the amount of rainfall that fell, it was the fact that a lot of its water drainage system was antiquated and crumbling. Because these days, we just, large infrastructure projects are not at the top of the agenda for many of us. But unfortunately, the reality is that the costs of coping with the disaster that's already happened are, of course, far greater than the costs of, a stitch in time saves 9. But when there's no urgency, it's hard to convince people that we have to do this now because a disaster is coming in the future. Everybody loves to be the hero who helps out after the disasters happened. Nobody likes to be the nanny who's taking care of people before the disaster happens to make sure they're okay. So not only do we have logistical challenges, we actually have psychological challenges, I think, in adapting to a changing climate because of the roles that people like to play, all the way from the individual person up to, the leaders of a county or a city or even a state. So I think we require a paradigm shift in public funding, and many of you there are much more able to speak to this than I am, so I hope this will come out in the panel discussion later. But we need a paradigm shift where we recognize that our vulnerability is going up as our antiquated infrastructure crumbles, number one. That is already happening. Then number two, climate change is exacerbating these risks, hastening the unsuitability of our infrastructure. And we have to take this seriously, and we have to figure out how we can prioritize the limited funds that we have for hopefully what are some win-win-win projects. Some of the most effective projects I've seen are ones that, for example, help with mitigation and adaptation at the same time. So in other words, putting on cool roofs or green roofs or solar roofs, not only do they cool the local environment, they might also produce energy if they're solar roofs too, but they also reduce the amount of energy load that the building needs to function. So that's just one example of a win-win-win. But I think we have to start putting on our thinking caps, and many of us have already, to figure out what are solutions that have multiple benefits, whether it's job creation, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's carbon mitigation, as well as building resilience and adaptation and increasing our quality of life as well.
Excellent, thank you. Another question, please.
Garrett Kirk with the Breakers. How close is the correlation between what you predict will happen and what actually happens?
That's a great question. So climate models have been producing projections of global temperature since the 1970s. And there's a really interesting article. In fact, if you want to message me through my Facebook page or through my website, I can send you this article so you can see it yourself, where they have evaluated models from the 1970s, from the 1980s, from the 90s, from the 2000s, the 2010s. They've evaluated them against what actually happened. And at the global scale, what was predicted and what actually happened is almost a perfect match. But when you start to go below the global scale, when you start to look at how fast the oceans are warming, or how fast wildfire risk is increasing, or how fast Arctic sea ice is melting, when we start to go below the global level and we start to compare projections and predictions with what's already happening, there was a paper that came out that looked at 20 years worth of projections from, I think, about 1990 to 2010. And what they found was either they were accurate or they were systematically biased. And this is the scary part. They were systematically biased in the direction of underestimating the rate or the magnitude of the change that actually happened. I can give you that paper too, so you can check it out. So in chapter 15 of the New Climate Science Report, which I encourage you to check out, it's science2017.globalchange.gov. In chapter 15, which I helped write, it's the most interesting chapter, but it's also a little bit the most scary chapter. We talk about how when you look at paleoclimate records and when we stack up our climate models against paleoclimate records, we're pretty clear that we're missing some pieces that lead to, over the long term, not over decades, but over centuries, over the long term, lead to much higher temperature change and much greater sea level rise than we are currently predicting. So it's not, it's not the next 50 years, but it is looking long term. We expect to see even bigger changes, and this is part of what's led to a greater understanding of the ice cliff disintegration in the Antarctic, which has led to the increase in the top end of sea level projections by 2100. We're always learning more about our planet. That's why it's so important to keep studying it. But unfortunately, we scientists tend to be kind of a conservative lot, and we tend to, more frequently than not, downweight rather than overweight things.
Okay. Another question, please.
Good morning. David Coddington, Greater Fort Lauderdale Alliance. You mentioned the Netherlands and the floating villages there, but with our lay of the land here in our community, with the sea level rise, in particular with the ocean on one side, the Everglades on the other, and the limestone base that lets water flow freely. Are there other communities, as in the Netherlands, that not only have the floating villages, but have really changed their approach from using the damming of their ports and so forth to using low-lying lands to use the water to actually adjust for the water flow? Are there other communities around the world that are taking a different approach like that to use some of the low-lying lands to take care of the sea level rise, or those times where you have exceedingly high tides?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is exactly what they are doing in the Netherlands, and they've been doing it now for a couple of decades. This isn't anything new. Learning how to live with the water rather than push against the water. It's a very different mindset, isn't it? Because the mindset from the 50s, which often carries through all the way to today, is we can engineer our way out of this. And so in Houston, they've been talking ever since Ike, they've been talking about building the Ike Dike. And, you know, a giant, massive engineered wall is going to be the solution. Well, in the Netherlands, they've had those giant engineered massive walls now for centuries. And they are definitely shifting their paradigm. And I'm sure others know more about this than I do. So hopefully, again, this is another theme that can come out later in the discussion. But they have been shifting their paradigm to help the water flow where they want it to, rather than holding it back. And there's a fascinating article I just read about a Houston suburb where they are taking a golf course and they are turning the golf course into a water retention area. And they actually even have a number on the specific number of homes that will not be flooded as a result of taking this golf course and turning it into a floodwater control area. And of course, natural wetlands as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, thank you, because you made for a layperson this whole conversation much more gettable, so I appreciate that. My question is on the short-term, long-term. Rosemary brought up, obviously, the funding challenges that exist. What are some of the short-term solutions that we could be taking here, obviously we're not Chicago, to help mitigate this conversation? And then what are some of the long-term solutions?
That's a great question. And I did not mean to, hold Chicago up as the epitome of excellence at all. I just wanted to get a little deeper with you into a single city to show you some of the breadth of issues and solutions they coped with. I know in Florida, many Florida towns, cities, and counties are already leading in implementing mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies. So right there where you live, you have incredibly good examples right in front of you. But one of the biggest problems I run into is people have this idea that climate change doesn't matter to them. And in fact, in the minute I have left, I'm actually going to share my screen with you to show you all a series of fascinating maps that are some of my very favorite maps. And if you don't know them, you will love them and you'll want to go back to them and take a look at them. Okay? So just a second here. I'm going to share my screen with you one more time. And I'm going to show you what's called the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. So if you want to write it down, just Yale Climate Opinion Maps is where we are going. Okay, so what they do is they ask people by county or even by congressional district or by metro area. They ask people questions like, do you think global warming is happening? It turns out everybody does. And down in Miami, it's very dark colored, if you can see that. We're looking at down in southern Florida, we're looking at over 70% of people in Palm Beach County, Broward County, Miami-Dade County think it's happening. But then, do we think global warming is mostly caused by human activities? Well, anything that's blue is less than 50%. And so often people focus on, well, we have to tell people this is caused by humans. People have to understand the science. They have to be on board with the science, because if they're on board with the science, then they'll understand why we need climate action. Well, what I'm going to tell you, and I hope you remember this is not the most pernicious and dangerous myth that the largest number of people have bought into. It is not. The most dangerous myth that we have bought into, the largest number of us, is not that the science isn't real, that humans aren't responsible. No, the most dangerous myth is, look at this. Will global warming harm me personally? Almost the entire country is dark blue. Even down in Miami-Dade County, Miami-Dade County is the only county in Florida that is not blue. It's 51%. So even in Miami-Dade, only half the people think that it actually matters to them. And in the rest of Florida, if you go up to Palm Beach, you're at 41%. Martin County's 36%. Indian River County's 35%. The most dangerous myth we've bought into that I think we need to, talk to people about short term is the myth that this doesn't matter. But it does, because in Florida, you can see the impacts with your own eyes. You don't need, CNN or Fox News or CBC or CBS to show you the changes. We can see them with our eyes. And so talking to people about what's happening in our backyards, how it's affecting our lives, and what we can do to fix it with practical, real-world solutions that are attractive, that work for us where we are, that are already happening, whether it's the amazing school kids in Florida who saved, I think, $30,000 the first year that they were allowed to make changes to their school to increase the energy efficiency, whether it's what, South Miami is doing with raising the street levels. We have real-world examples, and it matters to us, and I feel like that is the most important thing we can do, is share with people why it matters, how it's affecting us, and what we can do to fix it.
Thank you. Dr. Hayhoe, you can all see why it's such a privilege to have her here with us. Just amazing. So thank you so much for your informative and motivating opening for our summit today. We definitely want to thank you for your leadership as a scientist. I so appreciate your talent as a communicator and your focus on solutions. It's really provoking and inspirational. It sets the stage for a collective dialogue of, as you indicated, action-oriented outcomes that we hope to achieve here over the next 2 days. So once again, thank you so much for your leadership, for your generosity and your time here today, and have a wonderful conclusion to your family vacation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm now pleased to introduce Steve Adams, who is the Director of Urban Resilience for the Institute of Sustainable Communities and a facilitator for the Compact Staff Steering Committee in support of Compact implementation. Steve participated in the original creation of the Compact and has been engaged as a friend, a colleague, and a vital resource in the advancement of nearly every aspect of Compact activities during the last 9 years. Today, in keeping with our summit tradition, Steve will share with us some of the major activities and milestones by the Compact with the support of ISC during this last year. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Steve Adams.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be with you. It has become customary that I get a real point of privilege in being able to share lots of the updates from the cities and counties around the Compact region, particularly with respect to implementing recommendations and some of the real solutions that Dr. Hayhoe just described. It has been 2 years since our last summit, and as Mayor Furr noted this morning, last year's efforts by Palm Beach County, even though it was going to be an amazing event, Matthew had other plans for us. So given the 2-year backlog and activities to talk about, we've actually got a summit agenda which actually dives deep throughout today and tomorrow into much of the progress. So there are lots of activities, lots of points of progress that many of the panelists will be talking about today and tomorrow. So rather, I'd like to really focus my remarks on one of the major thrusts of effort over the past year, which is, in fact, the Regional Climate Action Plan. So at the first summit here, back in 2009, the counties launched the Compact process with 3 principal commitments within that instrument, one of which was the idea of a Regional Climate Action Plan as a framework document to guide policy alignment around regional climate policy, both in terms of building resilience to climate impacts, but also to reduce emissions that contribute to that. The first Regional Climate Action Plan was launched at the Key West Summit in 2012. Key Largo Summit, rather, in 2012. And in developing that first RCAP, the Compact made a really interesting choice in terms of thinking about how to structure that. It really came down to really kind of thinking about a 5-year cycle in recognition that no one has ever really tried to do this at this regional scale before. And the 5-year cycle recognized this notion of kind of planning and then doing, learning, and then reframing the strategies into a 5-year regional climate action planning process. So this, in the jargon, is adaptive management at its best. So this summit today marks the conclusion of the first regional climate action plan that was released back in 2012. It also represents the beginning of what we lovingly call RCAP 2.0. The public engagement of RCAP 2.0 would have begun last year in West Palm Beach. In fact, we had lots of fun engagement activities designed for that. But, undaunted, the Compact team has been working over the past year in assessing progress, consolidating learnings, engaging residents, experts, and local government staff, particularly municipal staff who do the hard work of implementing the RCAP recommendations. So over the past year, hundreds of people, literally hundreds of people, have shared expertise, opinions, ideas, and perspectives. Several working groups labored long and hard to produce RCAP 2.0. Appropriately, on behalf of the Compact, let me just say here publicly, there's a deep debt of gratitude owed to all of those who engaged in that process and helped to develop this new framework for regional collaboration for the next 5 years. So we're going to dive into RCAP 2.0 here, but first let me note a couple of things. RCAP 2.0 includes, as Mayor Furr noted this morning, 3 new chapters, one on social equity, one on economic resilience, and another on public health. These really reflect this idea of learning by doing, I think, quite well. And RCAP 2.0 now exists as a web resource rather than as a static print document. As you'll see, this enables us to do provide a much greater depth than what the RCAP can provide to those who are taking up the mantle of implementing the recommendations. All right, so I see, and if you go to the Compact website now, this is live on the site. You can also use a shortcut to get here, www.rcap2.org. That brings you right to the RCAP 2.0. So as I've noted, it is in fact a web resource. So there's a couple of different ways of cracking into this thing. The first is to just simply browse. Come to the home page and scroll down, and you'll see the particular chapters or issue areas that are contained within the Regional Climate Action Plan. So going on down, you'll see some the new items that we talked about, and you'll see some of the old chapters, or at least the kind of static chapters that have come forward from the first Regional Climate Action Plan. So Sustainable Communities and Transportation has long framed recommendations around growth management issues and transportation issues to contributors to climate change. Certainly 45% of regional emissions are associated with the transportation sector, for instance, and thinking about recommendations here, both in terms of building resilience and reducing emissions, is very important. So you can see that with each issue area, you'll get some opening narrative to help orient you. And then scrolling down, you'll see the actual recommendations. Let's jump into sustainable recommendation number 4, which deals with the idea of adaptation action areas and innovation that the Compact created during its legislative advocacy efforts back in the 2011 legislative session here in Florida. And then we've seen implementation focus on that throughout the course of the first Regional Climate Action Plan. So as you click into the recommendation, you'll see the particulars of what our working group experts have compiled in terms of thinking about adaptation action areas as a tool for land use planning. And then as you scroll further into this, you'll see specific resources that have been developed, white papers and other materials that have been published and really document very particular implementation efforts here in South Florida already. And then scrolling further, you see specific case studies. So given that we're here in Fort Lauderdale, you'll note that there's a very nice Fort Lauderdale case study talking about the implementation of adaptation action areas here within land use codes within the city of Fort Lauderdale. So scrolling down through this, you'll see the background, get more details, get more information. You see specifically the ability to go directly to the resources that the city has produced. Live links there, giving the land use planner in any of the 108 cities within the four compact counties an opportunity to dive in and look at these resources and think about how they could be applicable in their particular municipality. And then as you scroll further down, you see that as this was substantially similar to a recommendation within the first Regional Climate Action Plan, over the last 5 years, we have surveyed the municipalities and counties in Southeast Florida, asking them which of the RCAP 1.0 recommendations they had implemented. And so you'll see that these are the cities that have reported specific implementation. And you can click on any one city, say, we're here in Fort Lauderdale, so we can go look at the Fort Lauderdale page. Fort Lauderdale's homepage shows you where it is, shows you the case studies that they have produced, and then as you scroll further down, you can see the recommendations that Fort Lauderdale has reported to the compact that they have implemented already. Now, as we go forward, we will have opportunities for cities, obviously, to continue to report, and we'll provide linkages to each of the cities and the good work that they're doing, not only to help inform the public about all of the actions that are already underway and the real innovations that are happening here, but as a resource, too, particularly to perhaps smaller municipalities who lack the kinds of capacity, the staff expertise to really be able to kind of develop stuff like this out of whole cloth, really looking at sharing the capacity that we have within the region, which is a hallmark of the compact process. So you can just kind of scroll into this thing, right, and see all of the different recommendations, however you'd like to do it. But we've also heard loud and clear from many of the municipalities and other staff who are charged with implementing recommendations from the Regional Climate Action Plan that they'd like to have a better way of understanding which of these recommendations are related to what they do. So hearing that and really kind of thinking about and learning from how people in the past have used the kind of filtered views, we've created these filters for you. So just right there at the top, you can see these three boxes that enable you to say, I am I'm interested in, and I work in whatever particular capacity. And so just kind of hearkening to a bit of learning that I personally noted when Susie Toriente, my wonderful compact colleague, was the assistant city manager here in Fort Lauderdale. We saw her mark up the Regional Climate Action Plan in a really interesting way and then parcel out assignments to staff who were reporting to her. So I will call this the Susie Toriente scenario. So you say, I'm a municipality, and I'm an assistant city manager, and I have specific folks who report to me. So for now, let's just say energy and fuel issues report to me and water reports to me. So you can easily populate the filters here, and then you get a list of the recommendations that have been tagged for municipal users in these particular issue areas. And then, of course, you can scroll down and click into each one of these. So another feature here is that you'll see the orange bar there. You can actually download this. So this generates a report, and you can download this as a spreadsheet, and you can then use that as an opportunity to keep track of the work that's happening within your given municipality. So, so that is the Susie view of RCAP, if I may. So, if perhaps you're not working in local government, perhaps you're a local not-for-profit who is starting to think about communications issues. How can you help advance some of the work that local government is doing here? So by selecting nonprofit organizations and indicating that I'm interested in communications, you get a particular view. of the compact, or of RCAP 2.0, that shows you the recommendations that might be most important to you. Again, you can download that as a spreadsheet to help you manage whatever those things are. And so, the other kind of filter function that you could do is you could just say, I'm just interested in a couple of topics. I want to see, potentially from my point of view, I want to see some of the stuff that's kind of assigned to compact coordination. The 4-county multi-city agenda, and I'm thinking about social equity at the moment, so I want to see what that looks like as well. So you would enter this, and this might actually be my particular view at the moment to think about the kinds of issues that I want to do. So you will note that the website is live, and to the extent that folks are interested in seeing some of the great action that is happening across the region, and you'll hear more today. But do take a look. Look for these flyers. They'll be available out in the lobby at lunchtime today, and spend some time during the breaks going to rcap2.org. Thanks very much.
Steve, thank you so much for providing us such an impressive review of the work that went into the development of the second Regional Climate Action Plan over this last year. It's certainly a reflection of the efforts of many individuals and testament to the collaboration here in the region, and presents for us a pretty significant but tangible, achievable regional list of the to-do items over our next 5 years, so we look forward to poring over that. We'll now transition to the summit's morning panel session titled County Governments as Resilience Leaders. This session is moderated by Mr. Dan Lindblade. He is the president and CEO of the Greater Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce, where he has been a steady advocate for economic resilience through adaptation planning and active participation of the business community. And truly, he has been a vital partner in preparing for this year's summit. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lindblade and our panelists, the county administrators, who oversee the collection of activities undertaken via the compact and our individual counties. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Jennifer. Administrators, you want to come on up and join me? It's a great deal of pleasure for me to be here with you this morning. And as the administrators come up, I'll draw your attention to where they're located within your program. I have a kind of a standing rule that I don't read bios and whatnot when you have them right in your program. So on page 21 is Virginia, page 30 is Roman, page 34 is Bertha, and page 42 is Jack. And they're all here with us today. You know, one of the things that I was listening to some of the scientists, and I have a few scientists in my family too, administrators, and one of them works at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He's been there a long time. And I was thinking about this issue for the last 2 years. I've been at the Chamber for 10 years as its CEO. And I was thinking about, in the scale of things, as an administrator in your history, and you all have lengthy careers as administrators, but in the scale of all of the issues that you face, where does this rank within those issues? And let's start with Roman first. Roman, where does this rank in your list of issues that you have to deal with year after year?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. When you say this, what is this?
Resiliency,
okay, thank you.
Climate change, capital investments.
It ranks at the top two. Public safety, public health is first, and then definitely everything we do now, we consider resiliency, we consider our sea level rise. We have various plans that we're looking at now. We have a program, and so it's definitely, it's overarching everything we do, and we consider it and I'll get into it, some of the things that we're doing as
So first on your list, how about you, Virginia?
It is very important. It's one or two right at the top, because it's integrated within all of the other aspects that we have to deal with. Public safety, ensuring that we've got proper equipment, our buildings are hardened. so that we can address any of the issues we're having to deal with, stormwater. So there are a number of factors that we integrate throughout our, restoring our capital infrastructure. So it is number one or two at the top of our list as well.
How about you, Jack?
We went to the extent of making our budget a resiliency budget 2 or 3 years ago. And we used the budget process as a way of deciding what needs to get done in order and when. And so if it's not an issue that we have marked, and of course there's the things that keep going on every day, but if it's not a issue that we've marked, it's not ranked very high. That's both in operation and in capital.
Thanks, Jack. Bertha, how about you?
So it's clearly ranked high, and it has been for quite some time, thanks to our elected leadership. If I go back to the very first summit where Kristen Jacobs was very much in the forefront of pushing these issues, and then each year thereafter, more and more of my elected body members took on this challenge because they could see what everyone else is seeing. And then add to that, you have Dr. Hirado. And so when you have someone who is as passionate about this issue, it cannot take a backseat to anything that you're doing. So very high on our list.
Now, this is my first summit. We've been really what I would call scraping the surface of this issue as a business community only recently. We're really late to the dance, I would say, and we're engaging on it. And I was particularly struck with the map of the United States previously, and how many people don't think resiliency, climate change, global warming will impact them. And I think some of it has to do with just being able to wrap your arms around it as a human being. And as my brother would say, well, I'll be dead before that hits me. So I don't have to deal with it. It'll be somebody else's problem. But I look at this as a legacy issue for us to move forward. Speaking of particularly the business industry, and Jack, let's start with you. What do you feel that the business community's role is in this issue? And how can it better engage with government to support your efforts? How would you like to see that relationship grow?
We've been very fortunate to have an opportunity to work with insurance and the reinsurance folks, and who've looked at Miami-Dade as an example of what's going on. So that's given us one level of activity as the process looks for a new development that's going on in Miami-Dade. Dealing with the business community through their organizations. We're constantly having staff out with organizations, developers, constructors, the chamber, all kinds of folks to be there to answer questions and to make presentations. So we work with that, and that has had a huge impact as we start to look at things like our plan, our comprehensive plan down the road, what we're going to have to do with the building department's activities. The pushback has not been what could easily been because they've become part of this process, and we've been very happy with the way that's went.
Yeah, I think Miami-Dade in general, from a business perspective, from my conversations with colleagues down there, has been ahead of maybe Broward and Palm Beach County, Monroe. You've been dealing with a lot. And I should ask you, Roman, how are things down in Monroe before we go any further? Give us an update if you wouldn't mind.
Well, it's been a long 3 months. We're getting better every day. Thank you for asking. Monroe County is a very long county. It's 120 miles long. There was an area, Big Pine Key in the Middle Keys and the Lower Keys, that took the hardest hit. And that area is still hurting, and it's going to be a while before they get up and going. But Key West is doing fine. If anybody has any vacation plans to go anywhere other than the Keys, cancel them and come down to the Keys. We need you guys to come down to the Keys and start spending.
Amen to that. how's your business community engaging right now? What kind of role have they
Key
been
West
playing?
is coming back strong. They didn't get hit very hard. They were on the clean side of the storm, so they're back and running. The Upper Keys is doing well. Still, about 70% of the hotels in Islamorada are closed, so we need to get those going. One's going to open tomorrow, which is great. So seriously, we need folks to come down and help us out, get back up and running. But we're doing okay. It's getting better every day.
So talk to me about, if you will, what you see as the role of the business community outside of recovery efforts, but actually moving forward and working hand in hand with government, and what role do you see them playing, or are they playing with you down there right now?
Well, Jack touched upon it as far as the building and the building departments. We still have an adversarial relationship with some businesses and some contractors. But I got to tell you, after this storm, many of them have come up to me and said, wow, the new standards work. You know, you see it. You see the new building, they're doing fine. The metal roofs, the concrete roofs, they did fine. So folks are understanding what we've been saying all along. And Charlie Danger, some of us old timers remember Charlie Danger from building official after Andrew. You know, wherever he is, and I said this at one of the TV shows, and he was in Portugal of all places, and I guess somebody told him about it, and he texted me. You know, he's a hero because what he's done for the building code of the state, and it works. It really works. So I think the building community understands it now. They see it. It's clear as you drive up and down the Keys, the newer buildings versus the older buildings, the elevated buildings, the ones to the new standards. The new standards work, and it's clear.
What about you, Bertha? You've dealt with a lot of business leaders over the years. Currently, you're in conversations with everyone from the Broward Workshop to the Alliance to the Chambers. How do you feel about the relationship and where we're headed?
I think the relationship is wonderful. As a matter of fact, we all know that at the heart of this is the issue. The issue is funding, and oftentimes government, when you're starting to have dialogue with your federal and state partners, as a local government, you usually don't have as much influence as some of the members of the business community. But when you have a united business community that will en masse go to Washington, D.C. or go to Tallahassee and walk the halls of government, larger governments, to really talk through what it is we're trying to do in our community and really push our significant funding partners to, hey, don't forget what we're trying to do down here. It has proven absolutely invaluable, and we do appreciate that.
Do you have any ballpark estimate of the cost over the next 30 years that we'll have to pay for some of these?
Well, I can tell you that it's in the billions when you start to deal with the county, and when I say county, I'm talking about the canal systems, a lot of the, Dr. Hankel talked about the infrastructure that's 100 years old, and climate change, which is accelerating. So you have, with our water management district and other partners, there's just a lot to be done. There's a lot of resources that will have to come to bear along with all of our planning. So to say that if I have has there been a comprehensive number when you look at what municipalities are dealing with their water and sewer systems and the like, I don't have a number, but I do know when the county itself starts looking at these issues, it's in the billions.
Virginia, are you on an October fiscal year?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So your budget is passed for 2017, 2018.
Correct.
And moving forward, will this become a larger appropriation as you see it? And furthermore, how are you ramping up your staff structure to deal with this issue? So 2 questions, the money part and then the staffing part, please.
Which goes pretty much hand in hand. As in Palm Beach County, we're fortunate. We were able to work with our business community and partner with them to move not only our elected officials forward, but to help us move other business people that were not on board, as well as our residents, to support our penny sales tax to help with the renewal and replacement along with building other new structures to deal with resiliency and the change in climate that we're having, the sea level rise. And we actually put different infrastructure needs into the ballot language so that our residents would understand this is what we're doing. So it plays a vital role in our budgeting process. We're looking at renewal and replacement. We've got a lot of infrastructure that we need to replace, and we're taking into consideration ensuring that we're building toward the future, knowing that from '04, which I personally started having experience dealing with the aftermath of hurricanes through now, knowing that we need to adjust for our drainage system, our bridges, along with even housing, which is part of resilience as well. And so our business community has definitely partnered with us, and I agree with Bertha. They have a bigger impact when we go to Tallahassee and Washington for additional funding. They also have a bigger impact when we're trying to deal with the Corps and dealing with Lake Okeechobee, which is a constant issue that we must deal with, not only for Palm Beach County, but South Florida as a whole. We have created our Office of Resiliency. We created that a number of years ago. We lost our director to the private sector. I wish you guys would stop poaching my people from the public sector. But she was awesome, so we're in the process now of a replacement. We've assigned some additional positions. We also have a Department of Environmental Resource Management that assists us. And it has become part of we've got policies in our comprehensive plan as well as our code, our zoning code, that requires certain things. So we are very focused on ensuring that we're building for the future.
Do you think you're properly prepared right now?
No, I don't think we'll ever be totally properly prepared because the climate and conditions continue to change, and we as government must adapt to those changes, as the speaker talked about earlier this morning.
Yeah, I think that's the big item for me. I know I'm not properly prepared, and so that's why I'm coming to meetings like this. That's why I'm talking to really bright individuals like Dr. Jurado and making sure that that information comes back. As a matter of fact, and I'll share this with the group, we made this as a focal point for our strategic plan as a business organization. So if you haven't made this a pillar of your future endeavors and you aren't dedicating resources, that's definitely something you need to do. I know there's a lot of government officials in here, and that's the core group that we have, but for business leaders, we need to gather on this. And as a matter of fact, we're going to have a business gathering here tomorrow. We're going to also participate in the signing. We aren't going to be signing, but we are participating and going to comment on the compact's joint efforts moving forward, and we want to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction, I always say. Jack, I've known you for a long time. I mean, I've known you since I started back in the early 90s in South Florida. And as it relates to this issue, or these issues, there's a myriad of issues. And when I say issue, there's a lot more than just any given issue. But what's the one that concerns you the most, and why?
I believe that the way that we're going to deal with the short-term future is like all governments do in the short-term future, and that's dealing with the budget. So we focus what we're trying to deal with, even the long capital plans, but making sure that you look at the services you provide and ask yourself over and over again, is this a function of our resiliency? It's amazing how few items you can say no to with that question. Then there's the longer term issues like we're redoing our water and sewer system. It's 1,400 miles of water and sewer lines under Miami-Dade County. I can't imagine where, but and it's going to cost us $13, $14 billion by the time it's done. Everything that needs to get rebuilt is looked at from certainly a resiliency and its location and how it's built, and then the things that we're redoing, how long are they going to last, and how much do we want to put in them, and that ranking between the length of time it's going to last in our evaluation and the amount of money we put in. And then because we're moving, initially, like many of us on the east coast of Florida, a lot of our wastewater systems are on the eastern edge of the county. All of that's got to move to the western edge. Well, that's fun, except for the water and sewer lines that now flow this way now have to flow this way. So these are huge changes in that, but they are the fundamental issues that we provide to the business community so that they can grow and prosper. And without that kind of activity, we're going to find ourselves in trouble, not only with the federal government, but with our constituents who keep saying, we need more water system, we need more sewer systems. That's just one item of 100 items that we need to deal with.
Roman,
I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think my biggest concern, and I'm going to throw you a curveball here, is term limits. And I think term limits are really affecting some of these decisions. I'm very lucky. We have a commissioner that's been around 20 years, the mayor here around 10 years or so, another commissioner. All of them are in the double digits, or else getting close to double digits, and there is no term limits. So they're going to stick around. They're making decisions for the long term. You all have term limits, and it gets even worse at the state level because they make decisions to stay elected every 2 years, every 4 years. So we're making decisions that are 10, 20, 30 years out. And sometimes the elected officials just aren't wired to think that way because they need to get reelected. So they're making a decision that's something that's going to benefit the next generation. So I'm really worried about that. And again, I'm very fortunate. We're in a good place in Monroe County, but some of the communities at the state level too is a problem, term limits.
What about you, Bertha? What keeps you up at night?
Well, you have to look at what are you experiencing right now. And right now, we're experiencing a lot of flooding. We have communities, clearly there are times when they're not able to go home. I mean, you are impacted and you're frustrated, and as government officials, whether it's at the county level or city level, you know that in order to really deal with that issue, it's going to take a lot, and it's going to take a lot of activity that needs to happen right now. Hurricanes also have a major thing. It keeps me up. When I think about how we dodged a bullet, Maria didn't come our way. Irma started our way and did a shift, and I'm not embarrassed to say I was blowing it to the west, and I do apologize to those of you that may be from the western portions of this state. But one of the things that we saw, and I listened to some of the dialogue on a lot of our calls, again, when people, when they wait to evacuate and they're trying to move in this linear state in a region that's 7-8 million people, when you add visitors on top of it, it's very difficult. You're trying to always be ahead. We have people criticize, they say, well, we think the county pulled the trigger too soon with respect to opening up shelters. And oftentimes you ask yourself, do they really understand how many people live in this region? And if we waited to the last minute to ask people to move west from the east, how long that would take? So hurricanes and the veracity of what we're seeing now, the flooding that we can anticipate at any given time. The rainy season is kind of difficult to even predict now, because you used to be able to know what the rainy season, when it was going to occur, and now all of a sudden it's raining all the time, or it's really dry all the time. So it's the unpredictability of what is happening and how we can respond adequately to those issues, and what that means to the residents and the visitors and that spend time in our communities.
Virginia?
Well, what keeps me up is what Bertha and the rest of the speakers have talked about, and that is really the unknown. Attempting to be prepared for hurricane season, you dust off your rules and regulations. You get prepared to address storms that may impact you. But outside of hurricanes, you also have tropical storms. And we had a tropical storm. I walked to lunch one day, which is a couple of blocks down from the office. It was nice and sunny. We went in, it started to rain, and it just never stopped. It was Tropical Storm Isaacs, and we had significant flooding in the Midwest portion of our county. Not necessarily the eastern portion, but the Midwestern. And so it was a matter of, pulling staff together, and John Van Arnhem, which is my deputy county administrator, is here, took a major lead in ensuring that we garnered enough equipment, the high trucks and boats, and working with Fish and Wildlife and all of our other partners so that we could go out and make sure people were safe or get them medication or get them out to hospitals, because really we had some issues with our rescue responding in certain areas. So just ensuring that, number one, our residents are well informed, they're prepared when we first get an inkling there is something that we should be prepared for, such as unexpected rainfall or hurricanes coming, ensuring they've got their medication, et cetera. The other thing that keeps me up at night, especially now in Palm Beach County, is the lack of affordable workforce housing, which is a significant factor in ensuring that you've got a viable, resilient community, that when you do have storms or unexpected incidents occur, when your people have to leave the county, they come back. And so that's a factor that we are working with our business community very closely on in addressing that particular issue.
Jack?
I think there's one issue that we all deal with and we all sort of talk about, but we don't talk about enough. And that is the fact that this region goes from Palm Beach all the way down through the Keys. If you don't think that our workforce is migrating back and forth, ride with me someday from Hollywood to Miami and say, where are all these people going? They're going to work. Ride home with me and then see the other side of people that are going the other way. The transportation system is a wonderful way of understanding where your workforce is and where they're headed. I'm saying that because these issues, a lot of, especially the bigger issues, cannot be resolved by one of us working together, no matter how much money we've got to spend. We have to make sure that we understand how we're affecting each other, you got to deal with people like Bertha, whether you like it or not. And we have to be able to sit down and say, okay, Bertha, what are we going to do about this and this and this? This is something we do all the time. We don't do it enough, though. And I don't know, I said, I wish we could have spent more time trying to help in the Keys. Tell them what you said.
You guys were great. I mean, you helped a lot. All three of you helped a lot. Police officers, firefighters, first responders, you guys were fantastic.
And see, that's the kind of, that made my day. Yeah. Because that's the kind of stuff that we need to be able to do and not have to worry about, do we understand that no matter what, he needs help, we need to respond. And then as we start spending money, we need to make sure that the money we're spending ties together with the people that we deal with. We're not building stuff for inside of Miami-Dade County. We have to do more than that. So I think that this organization is great because they have recognized the 4 counties for a long time on this issue, and it's got national and international recognition for that. But I think we all ought to think about that for all the issues of resiliency, not just climate change and sea level rise.
It was really good to hear folk in New York, and I'm just going to tell, recently we had a visit with some of the rating agencies on some issues, and they have papers out now it's clear for many regions in this country. That's going to be a new factor that they're considering when they look at rating bonds and the like. And the good news is that because we have this regional compact and they can see that we are not just sitting around waiting for things to happen, that we're really changing our codes and we're modifying our budget processes, we're identifying all of our vulnerabilities and working on them, that's going to bode well for us. And the fact of the matter is, again, we go back to this issue of money. We certainly, if we can keep the cost of borrowing down, that's going to help us with our investment. So needless to say, we were all a little frustrated as we were evaluating the tax plan, and this isn't a political statement, this is just reality. If you are going to have as a high priority infrastructure funding or infrastructure development in this country, and the communities at the very lowest level are struggling to find the dollars to invest in infrastructure, and you're considering changing the tax code such that these funding sources that we really, local governments really, and state governments to that effect, we depend on, that you're now going to make the cost of borrowing more expensive. You know, sometimes you wonder, you know, who are you really linking your policies and practices together? But we were pushing that issue, and hopefully somebody's listening in Washington.
So since I have the mic and Bertha is my county administrator, I want to point out that I was sitting in my office on 3rd Avenue several months ago, and I get a call from Washington, D.C., I think, and it's an editor of a magazine, and they wanted to interview me about Bertha's expertise. And I said, well, why are you calling me? And they said, well, Bertha is the 2017 Public Official of the Year by Governing Magazine. So. Speaking of intergovernmental relations as it relates to cities, municipalities, county government, state government, and federal government, and let's focus specifically on state government. What do you all feel the state government's role is, and do you think that they are in a current position that is supportive, or what could they do better? And whoever wants to grab that one and run with it.
I'll start. Well,
better you than me.
Yeah. And I think I'm moderating the state elected officials panel in an hour or so. So, first of all, you know, in Monroe County, we generate, and compared to these 3 counties, it's nothing, but for us, it's a lot of money. $200 million that we send up to Tallahassee in tax revenue every year. By formula, we get about 20 back. If we do nothing, only 20 comes back, 10%. So for us to be able to continue to send that $200 million back, we need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to have proper infrastructure so folks will visit. So we've been going up for the last 4 or 5 years. We have an intergovernmental affairs department now, and we've been very fortunate. We've gotten about $191 million back additional in the last 5 years. So they're understanding. I think when you get up there and you explain the situation to them, it works. So that's why we have such a robust, we hire, between us and the municipalities, every lobbyist is on board. I mean, we have everybody, you know, like it or not, it's the way it works, and it's been very successful. So we spend probably between us and all the municipalities about $400,000, $500,000, something like that. So, you know, that's your return. You're spending $400,000 or $500,000, but you're getting millions back, so it's a good return on investment. So, and again, you have to get up there and explain the situation to them so you get some of that money back. So that's what we're doing.
So do you all feel, and anyone can answer this, do you all feel that the state government is appropriating enough dollars and distributing them wisely as it relates to resiliency? I'm not trying to bait the question
That is
too
a
much.
loaded question that you're asking.
Yeah, I'm really trying to gauge where we are in that relationship right now.
I'll take a stab at it.
You go ahead.
I ain't saying nothing. I need to work.
I believe that we need to continue to improve our dialogue with our legislators in Tallahassee, because some of the policies being made ties our hands. We're not necessarily getting the funding that we need for infrastructure and other needs within our locale, but yet you're putting a cap on how much we in our individual jurisdictions should raise in taxes. You're also now putting out a vote for a additional 25,000 homestead exemption that is going to be a statewide initiative. And counties that are not necessarily impacted with as many people as we have in South Florida will vote and tell us what we can and cannot do in our county. Our residents, when educated, make the vote they want. And in Palm Beach County, we pride ourselves on our quality of life. So they have voted for 150 million agricultural and preservation, and in addition to environmentally sensitive lands. They voted for cultural and recreational bonds. They voted for just recently 1-cent sales tax. And so I believe that local home rule should remain local and not necessarily dictated from Tallahassee. I also believe that if you're going to require government to provide services over and above what we have decided locally what we need to do for our residents, that you should associate the funding to go with it so that we can reduce the unfunded mandates that are constantly being placed on local government.
So I have one of my board members who is very, very active right now in Tallahassee on the affordable housing issue. And she's picked up the banner from, now my mayor, who's got a lot more responsibilities, as you can imagine. But again, the business community told us this is a real recruiting issue in this state. The local communities have been crying for quite some time in this region, and I can't even imagine how you're dealing with it in the Keys. But we've been crying for quite some time. If this state is going to continue to prosper, and the state is unwilling, or if I would say unwilling, but if the state has found other priorities beyond that which would clearly is having an impact in other regions of the state, there is a trust fund, we refer to it as the Sadowski Act, but it's a trust fund that was established to assist communities with affordable housing. It's a big issue here. And each year, and one of these days I'll figure out since when, so sometime in the mid-2000s, the state figured out that it can sweep that and use it for other priorities. So for all these years, when the initial intent was to make sure that there was sufficient affordable housing in this state, the money is being used for other things, because the state has determined that it has other priorities. But those priorities will quickly come into conflict. If you're talking about jobs, if your focus is jobs, 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 if you keep pushing the jobs, 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 and you're not dealing with where you're going to house these people when they're here, or how are they going to move about to get to those jobs, there's a disconnect, again, in our policies. So I think that there needs to be more discussion at the state level, tying all of their policies together to see what they're doing to adversely affect a policy that they say, or they have set aside to deal with in this state.
Okay, well, yeah, you can clap. You can clap. This is an opportunity for our audience to ask a question or two. And remember that these folks, collectively, they represent, depending on who you talk to, either the 9th or the 10th or the 11th largest economy in the United States. So I would recognize Ina Lee, because she's always the first one to ask a question. So Ina.
Thank you, Ina.
You're welcome. First of all, the name of this conference is called Climate Change. And we're talking about the federal government and the state government, clearly. And yet you have leaders of those two entities that don't even use that word. So clearly, and I think Rosemary asked the question, it's been a theme of how much billions of dollars this is going to take. So my question to you is, where is the money really going to come from? Because it's not coming from the feds that I can see. We, the chamber created the Washington Summit. Several people in this room went there. It's clearly not a priority there. And I don't see it's a priority at the state level. So how are we going to impact feds and state on this issue that's going to cost multi-billions of dollars, and then bringing it down to the local level? You passed the infrastructure tax. We haven't done anything in Broward. So where's the money going to come from? This is really, as I've been delving into this with Dr. Gerardo and other people over the last year, that's what I come down to. Clearly it's happening. Now what?
Okay, so we've got the tax that was passed up in Palm Beach County. What other opportunities are there? Bonding capacity? Let's talk a little bit about that.
The issues that we have found was that when you go to Tallahassee and you talk about climate change and sea level rise and resiliency, that doesn't sing.
Right.
So we talk about water and sewer systems and transportation systems, and we use the existing programs to chase money for jobs and redevelopment. I think it's, and I'm not trying to say we're trying to be sneaky, we're trying to be truthful. I spent 8 years in Tallahassee, most of which I was a deputy state budget director, so I clearly know what it's up against to try to fund this urbanizing state with a non-urbanizing budget. But we have to deal with the issues, at least with us in Miami-Dade, on a system-by-system basis, and we have to be the one that puts that together.
Question over here.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about housing and climate change. And I think that it's important that we have assessment about the impact that climate change have in minority community and communities that they're working poor. It's important then that somehow we take into account that if there is no investment in affordable housing, do they have any investments about adaptation and resilience for people that need affordable housing that is not just climate gentrification? So I think that we have to rethink also about issues when a heat wave come. Are we using cooling center, and what is the plan when we have heat at night and during the day, and then that probably people will be there more time than what is expected? I just wanted to know if it's a plan for dealing with those issues. Thank you.
I'm very fortunate in that my county commission has invested in its park system tremendously. And if you look at some of the enhancements and improvements, and this is to deal with cooling stations and the like, all of our facilities have major community centers associated with them, with air-conditioned blasting when it's really, really hot. Our parks are full of trees. We work really hard to make sure that there are places people can go to get respite. We have water stations for children to play. So there are the things that we would normally do, and I think all of the partners here have indicated that you really have to build into whatever you do today. You have to think about resiliency, you have to think about climate change, and you have to think about how would you modify or your designs of whatever it is that you're doing, to take that into consideration. It really, I would say 10 years ago, we had all of our managers trained to watch the budget, watch the dollars, and a lot of the things that you would normally do that you're doing today, back then, they start looking at the cost-benefit ratio, and no one was really factoring in long-term what the cost-benefit ratio would look like. So now that we're changing the vernacular within our own team, how do you think about when you are replacing your structures? How do you go about making sure that you insert resiliency and that you're able to talk about the cost benefit that inures from that? And it requires a constant conversation. You know, my elected officials, just about every other Tuesday, someone, did you put a solar roof on that project? So it's there, and it's in the psyche and the conscience of all of our people. So if we continue to do that and push that, you start where you are. You start building a momentum, and hopefully the folks in Washington and Tallahassee will see that there is something to it. We're able to show that when we built those dunes, and a lot of people really didn't want their beach view obstructed with these dunes, but when they were able to see where we built those dunes, we didn't have the devastation and the destruction of many of our affordable housing and other road networks and the like as a result of that. So sometimes it's just, we just got to show you.
Last question, we got 2 minutes.
During Hurricane Irma, we obviously faced some significant issues with cranes in our downtown areas. Of course, we want to continue growing and not stifle those things, but how do you balance that with also ensuring the public safety, not only personal safety, but investments in for homeowners and things like that? How do you balance those things as we face more extreme weather due to climate change with also ensuring the public safety during those extreme times?
Who wants it?
We don't have any cranes in the keys.
It's a
clearly not for me.
It's a public safety issue. I mean, that's how you look at it, and you got to make sure that you learn by what we learned from Irene and what we're going to Irma, and what we're going to sit down and how we're going to change things. Will it cost more money? Probably. No, but what's the cost of not doing it? And just like all government requirements that are public safety issues, you got to be careful what you're doing. You don't want to overcreate, but you want to make sure that, as far as you know, you're as safe as you can get.
We got a business panel coming up next. That'd be a good question for them. I know Mr. Palmer from Stiles is here, so he'll be happy to answer that. But ladies and gentlemen, our county administrators, let's thank them. Thank you very much.
Let's.
All right, thanks everyone. So now we'll break for 20 minutes for coffee and refreshments that'll be served in the lobby. During your break and over the next 2 days, we'd like to encourage you to visit the sponsors and the exhibits out there. Also make a point when you return to make sure you grab a seat rather than standing in the doorway. We're getting some concerns about safety. So we'll see you back in 20 minutes. Enjoy the break. Thanks.